mic on?
Hello. Hi.
Ooh.
Hi. Can everyone hear me? All right. Brilliant. And if anyone is watching online has any issues, sound, give us a wee wave, and Mohammed will try and fix things. Good evening. So nice to see the bookshop packed out, especially with rain. Well done, you. My name is Byrie. I run Lighthouse Edinburgh's Radical Bookshop, and it is such a privilege to have Lois Shearing back in the bookshop for another launch. I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then you're going to put your hands together and applaud. And then I'm going to ask some questions, and then you get to ask some questions, and anyone online who would like to can ask some questions. And then you can buy the book, and you can get it signed. And your ticket for tonight is a voucher that you can use against the book, so please do. And if you are too broke to buy a book, we have Pay It Forward, so if you want one, do take one. Which leads me to introduce our esteemed author. Lois Shearing is a freelance journalist and author. They are the author of By the Way and co-editor of It Ain't Over Till the Bisexual Speaks. They're writing on sex, sexuality, gender, relationship, digital culture, and politics. All of it brilliant. Has appeared in Cosmopolitan, The Independent, Mashable, Metro, Gay Times, and others. They are with us tonight to introduce their latest, Pink Pilled. Will you join me in welcoming Lois Shearing? Okay. This Pink Pilled is, people say books are timely, but I feel like it has been a few years of writing about women and the far right in very ephemeral spaces, in sort of pop journalism and BuzzFeed articles. And then we now have Trump, and we have Trump in no small part because of American white women. And it feels like having something so solid and so well researched and so rooted in so many of the different themes of why women buy into this outcrop of patriarchy, because there is no fascism without patriarchy, a movement, the far right, which hates them, hates us, and the why. And I think understanding the why, which you do so forensically, but also with such empathy, is going to be a really important part in unpicking where we go next with this. So I want to just do some scene setting for starters, and I want to ask you to define pink pilling, and maybe give us a little bit of the lexicon of the far right that we're going to hear about tonight.
For sure. I mean, can you guys hear me okay? Cool. Thank you for your very kind words about the book. So pink pilling is kind of a term that I use to describe like a type of radicalization journey, and we can get into radicalization a little bit later if that's a useful term or not. The radicalization of women and how that might differ to the radicalization of men. Obviously it's kind of drawing on the term red pilling, which has kind of been used in the far right for many years at this point, kind of to describe, like, I'm really sorry, my phone is ringing and I'm just gonna like decline the call real fast. This is so wildly unprofessional. Okay, I'm so sorry about that.
I think should we both move a little bit forward, and then you don't have a bookcase coming into your back?
Cool. Yeah.
Just so smooth.
Nice.
Okay.
Pretend this all happened earlier before we went.
Go for it.
Yeah, so it's drawing from the term like red pilling, which is obviously a term that's been around for many years at this point, taken from The Matrix. The more like academic version of red pilling is what's called a catalytic event. So it's an event in someone's life that destabilizes them to the point where they begin to like question their worldview and seek out kind of alternative points of view, alternative ways of thinking. So a catalytic event for a lot of people might be like a traumatic birth, it might be a big breakup. But for a lot of people it's also much smaller. Like one of the women who I examine in the book, her so-called like red pill moment or catalytic event is a teacher asking her to like reflect upon her white privilege. And for her, that was like such a destabilizing moment in her adolescence that she kind of sought out a lot of like more white supremacist and right-wing kind of worldviews. And so there's a lot of overlap between like so-called pipelines or like content that men and women consume in order to kind of build this worldview. Things like white supremacy, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. But I wanted to use pink pilling as a way of kind of capturing the stuff that appeals more to women. So things like medical misogyny, anti-vaccine content has a real like woman streak to it at the moment. Fat phobia, which we're going to talk about a bit later, and transphobia being one of the big ones in the UK right now. So there is a community online that uses the term pink pilling. It's very niche at the moment, but it's very much about like dating strategy, and it's about like how to date up. So if you've seen those like sprinkle videos on TikTok, like that is kind of pink pilled content. So it's about like how to be a high value woman in order to get a so-called high value man. That's where they're like most using it online right now on like Reddit and stuff. So yeah, I think we've defined like pink pilling. You guys may have seen some talk in the last few days about black pilling. I think since adolescence has come out, people have been talking about that a bit more. That term has been around kind of as long as red pilling has. So if red pilling is like getting people to question their worldview and like join the far or alt-right, black pilling is about like radicalizing people into just like nihilism. At the heart of fascism is this like death cult, and black pilling is about kind of speed running through radicalization to that like nihilistic death cult part of fascism. And then there's also white pilling, which is a lot less known about at the moment, but it's about kind of white pilling people into this like optimistic outlook, but it's an optimistic outlook which is also a very right-wing one. So there's a lot of different pills that you end up talking about. And then if you're talking about TERFs and transphobia, they use the term peaked instead of red pilled. So they'll talk about like what piqued them into questioning trans women's legitimacy.
I think one of the things that struck me in the book was all the different spaces that make up the far right that women are sort of lured into. And so I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about like different, how you differentiate from different bits of the far right, alt-right, manosphere, like these hateful spaces in which these women are sort of being lured.
Yeah, that was when I started out, one of the kind of more difficult things to navigate was there's so many like subgroups and sub-movements within the far right. Obviously the far right is like quite a broad umbrella term. Mm-hmm. And then within that, we kind of have the alt-right, which people still talk about a lot now, interchangeably. But the alt-right was a kind of time-boxed movement. It existed kind of between like 2012, 2013, up until about 2020, 2021. But the alt-right kind of isn't really a movement worth thinking about too deeply anymore. They've kind of burned themselves out. What has happened is that a lot of the people who were in that movement have either, the Overton window has moved so much that they've become just normal right-wing in the US, or a lot of them have further radicalized and have moved into kind of more hardcore movements like neo-Nazi movements. Some have gone a bit more like conspirituality and have moved into like QAnon type movements. So the alt-right is kind of gone. I think what we're seeing now in America is more like you could call it the new right. It's got some of the same characters, but not all of them, as in like it's the same people. And then in the UK, we have a couple of different branches of the far right. We have like civic nationalists, we have like ethnic nationalists, we have white nationalists, and they're all kind of the same, except they make little differences in the lexicon. In like ethnic nationalists think only people who are ethnically British should be here, whereas civic nationalists think if you have citizenship, you can remain in the UK. So like, if you see one in the street, it doesn't matter, but when they're like talking about it online, you have to make these differences for them. It's how they define themselves, and if you want to understand them, you have to understand it a little bit. But sometimes it's making hay out of nothing, I think.
There's a very grim underbelly.
Mm.
I don't know if it's even an underbelly anymore. It's sort of reached the surface. It's bubbling away quite openly now. Within that, we kind of, again, returning to that idea that we think that women would inherently be less likely to join the far right than men, or to be radicalized. And yet historically, women have moved into these far right spaces. And you have a great sort of historical roots. This is not a modern phenomenon that is entirely created by TikTok. We have a history of doing that. Can you talk a little bit about, the sort of historical space of women in the far right?
Yeah, for sure. I think like one of the myths I wanted to dispel was a way in which often the kind of popular press talks about this is like, oh my god, these women have just popped up out of nowhere and they're in the far right now, and like, how has this happened? Or like the first time Trump was elected, there was a lot of conversation about, 52% of white women voted for him, and a lot of people couldn't wrap their head around why did over half of white women vote for a man who talks about grabbing women by the pussy. But when you kind of look back at the voting record of like white women, particularly in the US, they have always like swung rightward. Like Reagan was elected mostly by like white women. And so I wanted to like ground the book in the historical precedent of women's contributions to the far right, including, women playing a big part in the resurgence of the KKK, like in the 20s. Women, obviously in the UK here, we talk a lot about the kind of like suffragettes to black shirts, like pipeline, where a lot of women who fought for suffrage then ended up joining the BUP and other movements. And so I really wanted to like explore that and ground that in like you said, this isn't just something that's happened because of social media. Women have always been really like key to these movements, and they've played a very similar role throughout the history of these movements as they're playing now. It just looks a bit different because we've like digitized some of that labor. So where women have always done a lot of the like reproductive labor of these movements in terms of both literally having children for the movements and in a kind of more Marxist sense of like doing the domestic labor, like keeping the movement going, printing flyers, sewing clan robes, like organizing family picnics. Now they're doing a lot of the like digital domestic labor. So they're creating content, they are like building online spaces. So their role has like stayed quite the same. It's just that now we see it a lot more because it's online. Whereas before, women get erased from history, and the contribution of women to hate movements has been erased in the same way that like the contribution of women to all movements has been erased. So I wanted to kind of shine a light on that a little bit.
Yeah, you do.
Thank you.
Very well. And very succinctly as a sort of anchor point for what comes next. And picking up on the suffragettes and that sort of historical element of like what the far right has offered at various points that might appeal to a certain kind of women. In that case, it was that you had the far right being perfectly happy for white women to get the vote. I want to talk a little bit about, in that sense, like the who are these women? We get a sense of who they were historically, but who are the women now that are joining the far right?
Yeah, I think that's quite a broad question. I think when I was exploring it, I found like a couple of different archetype of women who joined. I think like at the highest level, if we're talking about like who are the women who joined the far right, the answer is like overwhelmingly, like there are some very visible like black women in the far right. I'm thinking of like Candace Owens, and there are some very visible like trans far right female influencers, like Blair White, but like overwhelmingly they are like white cis women. Because the far right is a white supremacist, but also a cis supremacist movement. But then kind of within that, you get like, you could break it down by there are religious women evangelicals are a big strain of like the current American far right. There are the women who are very politically motivated, the women who came through like the identitarian movement and things like that. You then have the kind of like militia women, particularly in America. We don't really have militias so much here yet. And then you also have like just like straight up grifters, women for whom like they don't really believe the stuff they're saying, but they can make money saying it. In my head, while I was writing the book, I kind of categorized all three women as like seekers. So women who were seeking out a sense of community or a sense of purpose and were finding that in the far right. True believers, so people who genuinely really believed what they were peddling, and then just grifters who were in it for the money, in it for the infamy, and like would have just been fitness influencers if the space wasn't so saturated.
I want to come back to that point you made around cisness and a cis supremacist movement, and why there is a very natural overlap between like a natalist movement and this focus on birth and women giving birth, and that idea of womanhood that appeals to transphobes, and within that there's also, as you say, like health and fitness. There's a great deal of fat phobia. There's a great deal of like focusing in on what the feminine is. And so I guess my question is around like, how do we unpack and like find the connections between all of, like, what's the connecting force between why this movement is particularly like embodied?
I think the connecting tissue is like colonialism and a colonial view of gender and of womanhood. Like at the end of the book, I talk about white women as like in the far right as policing the borders of like, actual borders, but also like policing the borders of what womanhood is. And it's entrenching a womanhood which is a colonial version of womanhood, which is like white and cisgender and demure and thin and like middle class or upper class, and feminine, and if you are not any of those things, you are having a much harder time in these communities than the women who are those things, who are also having a really hard time in these communities. And so I think like it is a version of gender that is very like biologically essentialist, because fundamentally like one of the things the far right believes, or the modern iteration of the far right believes, is this idea of like the great replacement theory, which is that white people are being outbred by people of color, or are, more people of color are immigrating to this country, and that white people will eventually be a minority. And so in order to like combat that, you need to control immigration or deport people, but you also need to have more white babies. And you can't have white babies unless you have white cis women, or like forcibly detransitioned trans and non-binary people to like have those babies. And in the book I kind of make the argument that like, if that is your ultimate goal, you can try and encourage women to join the movement, but also like a lot of these men would be quite happy to just like force women to do that, which is what we're seeing with like the attack on birth control and abortion and things like that, particularly in the US. Sorry, it's very cold. And so I think the connective tissue is this like idea of reproduction, but also this idea of like a very colonial vision of gender.
Where would the fat phobia fit in that?
Yeah, like the idea of women being thin is a kind of colonial idea. There's a great book called Fearing the Black Body, which explores like the, not beginnings, but I guess like metastasizing of fat phobia in like Western culture as being a way of like putting white women above, particularly black women, by positioning black bodies as inferior to white women's bodies, like because of fatness. And the idea was like black women didn't have enough self-control to deny themselves food, or that like white women's bodies were like, the word cleaner springs to mind in terms of like leaner, cleaner, like more pure because they're thinner. And so it was a way of kind of, it's also very linked to this like Protestant work ethic and Protestant like denial of self. It was a way of like positioning white women as being more civilized than black women, because if you suddenly have like a lot of freed black women in your communities, how do you still have white women as being positioned as like better than them? And it's by claiming that black women are less civilized than white women. And so I think we're seeing like a return to like Finn is like being talked about quite a lot at the moment. I don't think people are being as overtly like racist when they're talking about it, but I think this like body fascism of you need to be like thin and strong and like prepared to do self-denial. I'm seeing a lot of it on social media. It's really worrying. I see a lot of skinny talk right now. One of the things I like explore a little bit in the book is a kind of like pro-Anna to alt-right pipeline, where young girls are kind of stumbling into extreme eating communities, and like the logic of pro-Anna communities is not super far from some of the logic of like far-right communities. But also, as Hazel Woodrow, who is an amazing academic and anti-hate researcher, points out, if you're hungry and starving, your like capacity for critical thought is kind of fucked. And so if people are like feeding you these ideas and you're not thinking on this right level, it's a lot easier to kind of internalize them. And so that is a very worrying trend I'm seeing right now. Is this kind of resurgence of like ED content online, mixing in with wellness content and fatphobic content and white supremacist content into just a horrible sludge targeted at young girls.
I think one of the things that I really appreciate about the book is that it feels like it's equipped me more to notice the dog whistles in trends that happen and be like, yes, yet another pipeline. Within that, I wonder if we could drill down into this idea of pipeline, which you kind of say in the book, like it's not that helpful, and you have a much better sort of analogy for the sort of soup that ends up with, or ocean, because it's much nicer.
I like soup as an idea as well.
for how and why.
Soup.
These women, vulnerable women, who might have very real and material grievances with liberal feminism or with capitalism, and being like, well, I'm being promised something a lot better. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can get into a little bit about like pipelines. I think like pipeline has become this real, the metaphor of choice for a lot of like discussion around, the wellness to alt-right pipeline or the gaming to alt-right pipeline or blah, blah, blah. But I slightly dispute how useful it is. As a journalist, I like totally get the need for a shorthand. If you have 1,000 words to explore this, you're not going to spend 300 of them being like, let's get into academic theory of like pipelines. It's just a useful term to have. But I think it oversimplifies what's happening a lot. And I think it also, that and rabbit hole, which also gets used quite a lot, takes away some of the agency of what is happening, because it makes it seem like you just stumble into this community and then almost without you noticing, you're like taken down this series of tunnels into the alt-right, and before you know it, you've adopted these views. I think there is a lot of agency here, and one of the things I wanted to get across was like, these women are victims, and particularly the younger women, they are being groomed, but like they still have agency in terms of what they do with these views. And like, not everyone is just falling into a rabbit hole. Some people are like actively seeking this out, and you still have, when you come across this content, you have the option to not engage with it, and they are choosing to engage with it. And so that, for me, like talking about it as pipelines does slightly take away that part of it. But I think it also takes away this idea that like there is a, you know, layer of the internet that is apolitical, and then you go down a pipeline into like the back rooms of the far right, and that's just like not what the layout of the internet is anymore. It's very like interwoven, and ideas of the far right have very much like taken over the internet. They've been so successful in mainstreaming their ideas. I did one of these events with Julia Ebner a couple of weeks ago, who wrote Going Dark, and then a few years later she wrote Going Mainstream. And I asked her, like, how are you not taking this book and just like hitting people over the head with it? Like, because they've been so successful in going mainstream. Like the far right and the alt right has just kind of reshaped the landscape of the internet. And I think a lot of us have picked up sayings and ideas and things that we don't even realize where they come from, and have like carried them into our lives. And that is something that worries me as well, is like how much the Overton window has just shifted to the right because of how successful they've been online. And women have played a really important role in creating that landscape. So I wanted to kind of get across that it's not just like, you know, women start out on Mumsnet and then they just so happen to end up on, you know, going to like LGBT rallies in this kind of false consciousness. They are also creating content and sharing these ideas, and yeah, it's not one directional, it's very multi-directional and multifaceted.
Within that, like those spaces and how women are getting exposed to these ideas and then choosing to absorb different things or bring into their lives different aspects of these far right cultures. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about, because the book has so many interviews, you're an investigative reporter, like there's so much research and living in these spaces and interacting with these women. I wonder if you can paint us a picture of some of these archetypes, like by picking out some of the women that you talk to, introduce us to.
Yeah, I think there was only one that I spoke to, and the rest I was doing like secondary research. But I picked kind of a variety of those women that I wanted to focus on and kind of build a case study of, because I think they all have like slightly different kind of journeys into being active in the far right movement. So one of them is Lana Lakhtoff. I think I always say her name wrong. It's written down in the book, you can read it. And she was kind of one of the OG kind of like alt-right girls. You know, she started life just listening to like shock jock radio in the US, like conspiracy radio in the US, and then now is kind of running her own sort of conspiracy radio station. She like moved to somewhere in Europe, one of the Nordic countries, to like marry one of the guys who was really big in kind of the European far right at the time. And then I wanted to look at kind of Lauren Southern, who is maybe like, if people know like any of the women in the alt-right, they normally know who Lauren Southern is. She kind of was like the poster girl for the movement for a while. She was this very young, like conventionally attractive woman who made a couple of videos on her own YouTube where she was talking about like questioning feminism, and then was very quickly kind of like talent scouted basically by Rebel News, which is this kind of like alt-right news outlet. And it's really useful for them to have women propagandists and to have far-right female influencers, because this like benevolent sexism and this idea that like white women in particular are like, you know, safe and gentle and mothering and nurturing. Having someone who has that aura projected onto them saying your views makes those views seem way less dangerous and way more accessible. And so it was a real like tactic of the alt-right kind of in the mid 2010s to find these girls who are willing to talk about this and just like shoot them up the ladder into like stardom, and give them a platform, because the far right through like the history knows that having women as propagandists is like a very effective tactic. and they're very good at jumping on new technology and using it to their advantage. And so jumping on kind of like YouTube and now TikTok and other social media, and combining that with, you know, the having like white women as propagandists was a hugely successful tactic for a while. I think it's died off a little bit now because no one's funding Rebel News or anything anymore so much, but they were very successful for about a decade.
I feel like there's so many of the points you make there, and like in the book, they're so well organized. But for me, I'm trying to untangle different bits you've laid out here. One of them I want to talk about is tech, and then the other one is once they're inside these movements, what the experience is for these women, which you detail in the book. And yeah, I mean, as one might expect, it's pretty fucking grim. Which one do you want to start with? Tech and the way the far right is using tech, or the experience
let's
in
start with
the
tech.
movement? All right.
I feel like I've spent 4 years researching this, and I do feel like if you just like rattled my head, just like different coins of stuff about the far right would like fall out of it. And so I'm sorry if it's not coming out in a super like organized way.
No, you're being very
thank you.
eloquent. It's my brain that has like all of these I'm very excited about all the threads that I've picked up through the book, so I'm just
I'm glad
pulling
you're
at stuff.
cool.
That's
Yeah, on the like tech stuff, they are very good at like jumping on new technology. Even if we look at like, you know, the original Nazi party, like the German Nazi party, Hitler was like using radio, which was like a very new technology at the time, and was a very successful tactic for him. I'm dyslexic and I'm going to get this acronym wrong. Ellie, do I mean DDBSs? Digital Dial-Up Bulletin Systems? Oh my god, okay. Ellie is my friend who is a very techie person. But they were the first people to be using these like digital dial-up bulletin systems. One of the first things that ever got uploaded to kind of the precursor to the internet was Holocaust denial material, because it is illegal to publish and reproduce in Germany, and like German neo-Nazis of the kind of early 90s realized like, well, this isn't under like German law, we can publish this material on here. And so like I think people often think of like social media as being something apolitical that's been corrupted, but actually like it has its roots in like military technology. It was like, you know, the internet was part of like code breaking in World War II. So they're very, very good at being ahead of the curve on new tech. And I think one of the things that's worrying me right now is they're very ahead of the curve on AI. Like even when I was writing this and kind of the AI bubble wasn't what it was, they had started using AI to kind of produce like very rudimentary memes and poems and like stories that they were then like sharing around, and now that's really like spiraled out of control, like blossomed, I guess, in as they would see it. And like the Alternatives for Germany had this like not even a real woman, she was a AI generated woman that they were using in their campaigns to talk about how she didn't feel safe in Germany because of immigration. And I think it just like encapsulates so well that these movements need women to kind of like back up their ideas and femo wash their ideas, but they also don't want women in their movements because they fundamentally don't like women. And so if you can AI generate a woman, that's great. You don't even need a real one anymore. And so they've really like jumped on that technology to just like sidestep having to have actual women in the movement, which they're very happy about.
Again, that sort of exemplar of like, they really don't want women there, and yet they need women. So what, can you tell us a bit more about what it is to be a woman in these spaces? Some of it is, it's not surprising, but it is horrifying.
Yeah, it is horrifying. Like, the women in these communities are experiencing like intimate partner violence and sexual violence at just like a terrifying rate, and in a way that like a lot of us kind of can't imagine. They're kind of sold this idea that they will be safe and protected in the far right from this like sexualized threat of the other, who is usually either at the moment a brown man or a trans woman. But then once they're in the movements, they are experiencing just like huge amounts of sexual violence, intimate partner violence, harassment, misogyny, degradation. And it's very scary, and it's very scary particularly for young girls that are, I won't get too deep into it because it's not very nice to talk about, but like groups of older men who are just online recruiting out young girls specifically to kind of like groom and harm them into kind of neo-Nazism. They were like some of the worst parts of the internet that I saw while doing this research. But for all women, it doesn't matter how recommend reading if you want to read an academic text on it. It's called the Misogyny Paradox, which talks about like the more these women in the movement try to play up to the type of woman they're expected to be, kind of somewhat ironically, the more misogyny and harassment they experience. Because fundamentally, to the far right, there is no right way to be a woman. The only right way to be a woman is to be an AI. And so no matter how much they like try to be the perfect woman, to be the perfect tradwife, to be the perfect like militia girlfriend, they are fundamentally never going to succeed. And what they experience is just like huge amounts of violence and harassment. And it's very difficult to leave. Like, if you were in a so-called traditional relationship where your husband has the money and the bank account and all the resources, like we know from just like talking to any survivors that it is much harder to leave. And the most dangerous time of a woman's life is when she tries to leave an abusive relationship. And so if you add into that, you know, the man you're in an abusive relationship with is in a hate movement, that's even scarier, even more dangerous. But it does raise a lot of questions about like, what does de-radicalization or leaving the movement look like for women? How does that differ for men? And kind of, what can we do to support women leave these movements? And kind of like, how much, you know, resources are we willing to put into that? I don't claim to have the answer to that in the book, but I think it's a question that's like not yet even being addressed because so much derad stuff is done by men for men, that I think like women and the fundamental first step of you can't leave a hate movement unless there's somewhere safe for you and your children to go isn't yet being addressed.
Thank you for that. I've just realised I have no way of keeping track of the time. Peach, can you give me a time check?
Yeah, you've got 15 minutes.
Okay, great. Thinking caps on for you guys. So when you are ready to ask questions, stick a hand in the air and I will bounce it to you. I think one of the really powerful things in the book is how you reconnect the reader with the idea of like any woman, every woman, but especially cis white women, can be part of these movements and they are part of our communities, and how do we square the circle around that duty of care to be able to bring women out, which we need to if we need to dismantle these movements. But it was really interesting to me around concepts like the tradwife and like these movements that are using old-fashioned patriarchy to rebuild structures which feminism has dismantled. So, and the same with rolling back reproductive justice. It's like, if we can trap them in a marriage where they have no money of their own, they will not leave. If we can trap them with a whole load of children, then they will not leave. If we can make sure that we get them out of education early enough, then they will not leave. Then there are those who are the face of these movements that ostensibly have a lot more freedom. And I would say a lot of those, like the grifters, who, can you talk a little bit about these women who have full-time jobs as content creators and are not wives and mothers with a brood at home and yet still get to be the face of this movement, tricking or leading other women into thinking that it's a life.
Yeah, I think one of the most fascinating things about the like tradwife content is how it's like so edited and curated to look like it hasn't been edited or curated at all. Like, you're supposed to believe that you are just a fly on the wall watching this woman go about her day, and her day involves her like getting up and baking bread and like going out barefoot to feed chickens and like I don't know, whatever else. Which also, as someone who grew up on a farm, don't be barefoot around chickens. That's like, there is like a chemical in chicken poo that is really bad for you. Don't be barefoot around them. But you are supposed to believe that you are just like watching this person go about their day. But actually, like every time you see a cut in the video, she's resetting up a tripod. She's doing the take again. She is like editing it together. She's producing a content schedule. Like, it is skilled, difficult, time-consuming labor. It is a job. But it is a job to convince you that she doesn't have a job. And I think, like, that is just so much of what, like, womanhood has been reduced to, is, like, women's labor is just innate. Women just do it because that's what it means to be a woman, is to work and to serve. There's a really cool essay I recommend reading called Theory of Gimmick, which kind of, like, suggests that to be a woman itself is to be a gimmick, because a gimmick is like shrouding the very technical work that's going on behind the scenes to make something happen. And like when we think about womanhood, that's so much of like what women are expected to do, is to like do the work, you know, make Christmas happen, lay this beautiful thing on the table, but to make it all seem effortless and like it just happened. And tradwives are really good at that at the moment. And I think if you are someone who is in a job and you're really burnt out and you are tired, and then someone is showing you these videos over and over again, being just like, you can have this life that's just full of like breezing through your day, having time for yourself. That's really powerful for a lot of like frustrated young women right now. And like post-COVID, when women are much more likely to be in gig work, bore the brunt of a lot of the like financial and economic fallout of COVID, a lot of women are like struggling to be in employment right now. And I think this idea that like you don't have to be in productive employment and then also be doing like the domestic labor of the housework has been really powerful. But it's also a false dichotomy, right? Like, there are other options between being like a girl boss, having it all, and being a tradwife. And I think like the far right in the conversation right now is setting up that dichotomy because it's so powerful. Because if you tell women like there are other options, you can do collectivized feminism, they're not going to get radicalized as much. I hope. And so yeah, I think that is something that I found really frustrating to watch happen, especially as someone who has like done social media as an actual job in the past, to watch so many people fall for this idea that like social media is just so effortless and housework is just so effortless and like you are not doing labor here, was really frustrating, but also really interesting to contrast to the men in the far right who are creating content where they often use women as props in the background, like having... Has anyone seen this insane influencer video of the guy who's like filling his face in water
Yes.
every day? I'm fucking obsessed with it.
Yeah.
I was making Eddie watch, like, I was telling Eddie about it before we literally came here. But part of that video is that, like, a faceless woman hands him the water to dunk his face into and, like, puts his watch on for him. And it's, like, a tactic that Andrew Tate was using in his videos, where, like, a disembodied woman comes and, like, tidies up around you. And I think it's really interesting to see that contrast of, like, men don't exist in these tradwife videos because you are the trad husband. The work is being done for you, and women just do work. Whereas in, like, content created by men, there is a disembodied woman doing the work for you in the background. And so I think that, again, that dichotomy of, like, whose labor we get to see is really, really interesting.
Thank you. Do we have questions in the room or a question on? Yeah, go for it.
You talked a lot about like a lot of right-wing online reviews back in 2018, and now I just use it.
Yeah.
What can we do? Because I feel like that battle's lost.
Can you put the question in the answer for anyone who's watching online?
Yes. So the question was, sorry, I did that really unsubtly. You were like, make it part of the answer, and I was like, I'll just say it. The question was like, how do we, so much like verbiage of the far right is just like mainstream now, including words like based. People use the word red pilled about just like anything now. The one that personally drives me fucking mad is like, everyone's forgotten the word woman and just says females now. And I hear it, oh my god, it drives me mental. I hear it all the time. I don't know is my answer. I think part of me is like, there is some power in reclaiming it, in reclaiming like what it might mean to be based, in like what it might mean to be red pilled. I think that one is maybe lost for good. But I also do think there is power in just like when your friend is using, or like people you know is using these terms, to be like, hey, what the fuck? Like, why have you just picked this up? Because it is so mainstream and it is so like corrosive. It's corrosive to our language, it's corrosive to like the way we think. And it has been like one of the most powerful tactics of kind of the alt-right and the digital far right to create this lexicon that has just become so mainstream and has carried their ideas kind of so far offline for them. So yeah, I think, I'm not sure, I think some of it we can reclaim and then some of it we just have to try and like stamp out as much as possible. But I don't know where we draw those lines, unfortunately.
Like people still say, like, I think normal people say tradwives now, like it's a thing that existed
Yeah.
10 years ago.
That really frustrated me. I was working for a women's magazine that shall not be named while writing a lot of this book, and I like tradwives. To me, the term was coined by the alt-right, and I think it's a term that you can't like extrapolate from the alt-right. But now any woman who like bakes bread online is called a tradwife, and that's like, to me, the concept of a tradwife is one that is like inherently white supremacist. But like you said, it's just used everywhere now, and I think in a way that broadening maybe has some positive impacts. That means that like actual tradwives aren't able to get as popular because like there's more tradwives making content. But in another way, I'm just like, why have we normalized this word so quickly? It's very frustrating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's definitely a power, even in just interrogating where did you pick that up from?
Yeah.
Even for ourselves. Is there another question in the room? Yeah, go for it. I'll just give you my microphone.
Ooh.
And then you don't need to repeat it.
Okay. So I'm curious what you'd think. So you're talking a lot about, I guess, women that are sort of being pulled into the far right, almost instrumentally, right, by men. So what would you say about the women that are leading the far right, like Maloney and Italy, like the classic examples, invite originally. What is happening there?
Yeah. I know a little less about that. I'm going to look a little bit into Le Pen and her background, but I looked a little bit less into like Giorgia Maloney and those kind of people, just because I wanted to focus a bit more on like digital radicalization. But I think one of the roles they're playing is they've been really instrumental in like softening the party image. So like Le Pen, for example, she almost inherited the party from her dad and has been so much more successful than her dad because she has really pushed this idea of like, I'm just like a wife and mother and I'm worried about, you know, the women of France and the traditional values of France. And it has been much more successful than when men lead those parties because it makes the party seem a lot more accessible and a lot safer. And like Giorgia Maloney is doing a very similar thing, right, where she's talking about like family values and returning to like traditional Italian ideals. When her like beliefs and arguments are fascist and like far right. And I think like it's very frustrating to watch the media and like commentary around these women kind of take the bait a little bit and like accept things and report on things that like if a man was saying them, they would be much happier to like call out as like far right or like violent and dangerous ideas. And I think like far right parties in Europe are very cognizant of that, and I think it is very deliberate that they have like a lot of female leadership right now, to like make these ideas seem safer and more palatable. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay. Cool, thank you.
Yeah, there's one at the back. Go for it.
You mentioned about like the anti-vax movement and the far right and how women are kind of propelling that, and I feel like you see it with just generally like unhealthy, dangerous practices like being anti-vax or promoting raw milk or whatever it is. Can you say a little bit more about how women are pushing that forward and maybe why they're doing it?
Yes, I think there's kind of two strands there. So like anti-vax stuff and health stuff does overlap a lot, but there also is like some differences. I think like fundamentally what's at the heart of that, like for women, a frustration that I saw a lot, or like a catalytic event I saw a lot, was like experiencing medical misogyny, which is like a really valid thing to be pissed off about. But for a lot of them, they would kind of experience difficulties in like in a medical setting, and then go and seek out like alternative medicines, which is why we see a lot of like women in the kind of alternative health and medicine space in general. And the far right is like a very opportunistic movement and like willing to capitalize on that. But there's also, with like the raw milk stuff, some weird like esoteric explanations where it's about like connections to the land, and like not putting, chemicals are seen as like a globalist conspiracy, whereas if you're just like eating off the land yourself, you're eating like organic and raw and natural, and it's a way of like justifying a person's connection to the land when that person maybe doesn't have like an indigenous connection. So there's a couple of different streams there. And also this idea of like medicine and modern medicine is often like linked to like Jewishness. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in the like anti-vaccine movement as well. So yeah, it's very murky waters. I would struggle to get into all of it in this time, but yeah, that was kind of something I saw a lot of.
I think one of the things that kind of carried through was how opportunistic the far right movement is when it comes to the way that it interacts with women or plucks women out once they're in, rather than the very targeted recruitment that happens that is targeted at men and boys.
For sure.
Do we have another question in the room or one online? You're being shy. I will give you a beat. I have another question just about how fast moving everything is right now. But I think generally with tech and digital spaces, but the far right is evolving very quickly, and this was a book that could have endlessly been researched and written, but at some point it had to be published, and so you finished writing pre-Trump election?
I did, yeah.
Is there anything that you know now or that you're seeing now that you wish you'd had a chance to either include in the book or grapple with in the book?
Yeah, quite a few things. Stuff does move so quickly. Like I think the final manuscript like had my claw marks in it because MEP was like, you have to hand it over at some point. But I handed it over, it got finalized, and then obviously like the race riots of last summer happened. So there isn't really anything about that in the book, which I wish I'd had kind of the opportunity to get into because women were very involved in that. Obviously the Trump election, which I think, I don't know, it did slightly blindside me, which I feel a bit naive about, having like written this book and then still feeling blindsided by it. And then the other thing that I think has changed quite a lot is I talk a little bit about the role that tech moderation could play in like stemming these movements. I really don't feel that way anymore. I think like particularly with like Zuckerberg coming out and saying all this stuff about like we need more masculine workforces, like someone who's saying that is not gonna care about trying to like content moderate misogyny, right? something I get at a little bit in the book is sort of the bottom line for social media is that they are profit generating machines. And if it's more profitable to like let hate fester, which I think we've seen that it is, then that's what they're going to do. And now that they're in an environment where they don't even have to like pay lip service to moderating hate content, and in fact, you know, it's maybe better for them to pay lip service to the idea that they're just going to let like free speech reign. That is what we're seeing. And so, yeah, I no longer think that like tech moderation is going to play a huge role in challenging these movements.
Thank you. How are we doing for time? Do we have time for one or two more?
One more.
Okay. I have two hands, so you're going to make them really quick, and then we'll do 1, 2, and then you can answer both.
Cool.
Yeah. Effortlessly. Go for it first.
So my question was kind of in the UK context. Obviously we've seen transphobia as a rise, and it's something that feels almost like it's reaching more and more out of right-wing spaces. Obviously with the Labour Party's recent policies and things like that. Do you think it's fair to describe it as one of those like pipeline opposition spaces, or do you think it is always and will always be just firmly solid within the far right?
So one question on transphobia, and then
Yeah, my question to you, when you sort of introduced the book, you mentioned that actually you kind of take quite an empathetic approach, and I just wondered whether you feel that there is sufficient empathy more broadly within society for these people that have entered into these spaces, and whether perhaps an insufficient degree of empathy is actually what's holding back action that can be meaningful to draw them back out.
Both very good questions. I think transphobia has been one of the most successful radicalizers, pipelines, whatever you want to call it, of like the modern far right movement, of like the fifth wave far right movement, particularly in the UK context, but like becoming more prominent in a US context very quickly. I think like I see transphobia as being inherently right wing. It's about like creating a hierarchy out of like people. But it is like bleeding a lot, as you said, into like more progressive spaces. But I do think that in doing so, like one of the things I found while doing this research was a post on a Mumsnet thread where someone was talking about like, oh, you know, I've started questioning some of my beliefs about trans women, and now I've started questioning some of my beliefs around like other progressive ideas. Has anyone else had this same thought? And it was a horrible thread, but it was such a goldmine for me, because it was like them just laying out how like transphobia had caused them to like question their so-called like feminist or progressive ideals. And so I think like that is a very key way in which like, yeah, women who otherwise would have considered themselves like feminist, and many of them still do, are being like led into like far right spaces. And then with the empathy question, yeah, I like fully agree with you. I think there is like there is a lot of empathy for like, I think adolescence is a good example of this, of like talking about the loneliness epidemic for young boys, when you look at the stats, like there's a loneliness epidemic among everyone right now. And same with like women in these spaces. I think like something I grappled with was like wanting to humanize them to the point of being like, this could be you, in terms of like, you think you are immune to this propaganda, you're probably not, but also not to humanize them in a way where people felt sorry for them. Like all of the women in this book are victims and survivors, but I don't necessarily think, I think you should feel empathy and feel angry that they have experienced this violence, but I don't think like we need to feel sorry for them for joining these communities. But it's like a really hard line to grapple, and I think like something I talk about is outside of this book, I used to run a support network for survivors, so I've done a lot of survivor work. And this like binary we have between like survivor and aggressor, or like victim and aggressor, and always seeing like victims as good people almost, and always seeing aggressors as like terrible monsters, is something that is not useful in this context. And we need to be able to talk about people as like both having been harmed but also doing harm. And I think there's a real like carceral logic between the idea of like, if you have done harm, you can only ever be a bad person who causes harm. And if you have been harmed, you can only ever be a survivor who like is incapable of doing harm. And I don't think that's useful in this context, because these, particularly the young girls who are being groomed and almost trafficked, are like being hugely harmed, but are still contributing to harm. And so we need to think about it in a slightly different way to how we might think about like men in these movements. So yeah, but I also do think that like societally there is a real lack of empathy for people who are harmed by the far right, and like challenging that is going to be one of the ways that we challenge the movement in general.
Yeah, I think in that way, we mentioned earlier Sophie Lewis's book, Enemy Feminisms. Like, I feel like your book arrives into a moment and dovetails really beautifully with some of the writing on contemporary feminism that is around women doing harm. And there's some great writing by trans writers as well around ideas of trans misogyny. Pink Pilled is an extraordinary and accessible look at the moment we are in, and how we got there, and importantly what we do with that now that we do know. And I think for me personally, that question had always niggled, like, but why would these women join? And it's like, well, now thank you for giving me an answer to that niggling, annoying question, but with an incredible amount of nuance, and you resist the urge over and over again to simplify and flatten the issue. So thank you for this brilliant book. Thank you for tonight. Will you all join me in saying a very big thank you to Lois Shearing?
And thank you for hosting. It was wonderful. I really enjoyed it.
I'm going to ask you all to keep your seats for just a second so we can extract ourselves from you. We are going to make our way out, and then we're going to be in the front room, and you can buy a book, you can get a book signed.